It flies over Korea, looking wrong. 2 full-length fuselages, 2 cockpits, 2 Allison piston engines that could push it to 400 miles an hour, all with a single wing tying them together. America's F-82 Twin Mustang was built for a different war, but in 1950, against North Korea, it still had one very special ability to offer. At the start of the Korean War, 100,000 North Korean forces drive south so fast the transport aircraft at airfields around Seoul are suddenly launching straight into contested skies. They need fighter cover, but the jets based in Japan can only remain for minutes before turning back, leaving the evacuation exposed. So something else goes up to meet them, a machine stretched and doubled into a form that almost doesn't make sense. 2 fuselages, 2 cockpits, 1 wing stretched between them. It looks less like a fighter and more like something forced into shape. Built for a different war, designed for range instead of speed, it's the only one that doesn't turn back. On Sunday, June 25th, 1950, at dawn, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and drove south through South Korean lines. This charge was so massive and fast that Seoul, the capital, just 35 miles from the border, was in immediate danger of falling. With Soviet-built T-34 tanks rolling at the very front of the approaching column, countless American military families, embassy staff, and civilians from a dozen nations poured toward Kimpo Airport outside the city, looking for a way out. Washington needed air power over Korea as soon as possible. At the time, the Air Force had the F-80 Shooting Star already in nearby Japan, a state-of-the-art jet fighter, fast and modern, exactly the kind of aircraft the post-war service had built its identity around. However, the models burned through their tanks so fast they would only get a small window after reaching the peninsula before having to turn back, making the most advanced fighter in the Far East, and perhaps even the entire world, effectively useless. Instead, the call went to the least experienced of choices, America's last piston-engine fighter, the F-82 Twin Mustang. Nothing in the American inventory looked anything like it. North American designed the model in the middle of the Pacific War, when America needed escorts capable of flying B-29 bombers from the Marianas to Japan and back. For these long missions, engineers blended Mustang fuselages, stretched them, joined them at a newly assigned center wing, and put a crew member in each of the cockpits, a pilot on the left and a radar operator on the right, dividing the work on missions that stretched up to 8 hours over open water. Though it could fly 2,200 miles without stopping, the model arrived too late for the war. And by 1950, with the golden era of the jet, everyone assumed it was completely obsolete. Now, 40 of them, split across 3 squadrons, were all that stood between the Far East and the full wrath of the communist bloc. That same day, the 8th Fighter Squadron F-82 air crews on alert at Itazaki Air Base in southern Japan received their first mission: fly to the peninsula, find the main roads and railroads, and report back what was moving on them. The rules were clear. They were not to engage with anything. The flight climbed out over the Korea Strait into solid overcast, cloud top sitting at 8,000 feet. In the left cockpit, the pilot held course on instruments, flying blind through weather that would have sent anything without radar back to base, while in the right cockpit, the radar operator had his face in the scope, working the sensors, reading what the clouds were hiding. At 2,000 feet, the clouds broke open, and the peninsula spread out below them. The roads were packed from edge to edge with multiple convoys, stacked on every major artery running south. Trucks so close together, the columns looked continuous from above. Despite the hum of the engines, nobody on the ground looked up. There was no reason to. The invasion was already happening, and it was already working. The crews had no orders to do anything but watch. They made their passes, turned north, and flew back across the strait to Itazaki, where a colonel from the staff of General Douglas MacArthur, commanding all U.S. forces in the Far East, was waiting. It was the first American air combat mission of the Korean War. By the following morning, the priority was clear. Seoul was going to fall, and everyone who could get out needed to do so as soon as possible. The Norwegian freighter Reinholdt was already sitting in Incheon, loading anyone who had made it to the docks before the city closed for good. At the same time, a group of F-82s from the 68th Fighter All-Weather Squadron launched from Itazake, arriving over the harbor as the sun came up. A couple of aircraft dropped down to patrol the road running in from Seoul, watching for anything coming south, while the others climbed above the docks and began circling. From up there, the crews could see the smoke rising over Seoul, maybe 20 miles inland. The city had been under attack for less than 24 hours, and it was already burning in places. For hours, the crews circled above the harbor, eyes scanning an empty sky with nothing to show for it. Then, just past 1 in the afternoon, 2 Soviet-built fighters punched through the cloud base without warning. Suddenly, the sky wasn't empty anymore. Though their type was never officially determined, it was clear that the models were Soviet-built from their shape. What was certain was the direction they were taking, and that they were heading straight toward the Americans. Their orders of no aggressive action stopped making sense then and there. The pilots flipped the gun switches on, dropped their external tanks toward the harbor below, hit combat power, and surged forward, climbing hard into the threat. The North Korean at the front of the formation was already committed, already in his turn, his nose pointed directly at them, and his wingman right behind. The leader fired a first burst, the rounds arcing across the sky and falling short by a small margin. The F-82 pilots pulled up hard and punched through the cloud base into clear air above the overcast. From up there, they had the altitude and the position, sitting above the gray ceiling with their guns ready, waiting to see what came up through it. If the North Koreans followed them, they would be climbing blind into aircraft already pointed down at them. Instead, the enemy broke off and disappeared back into the clouds, and the sky over Incheon went quiet once again. By the time Reinholdt cleared the docks with 682 civilians aboard and turned south towards Sasebo, the crews had been circling for hours, protecting their escape without firing a single shot. During the first days of the conflict, Douglas C-54 Skymaster transports were still flying civilians out of Kimpo Airfield outside Seoul and needed protection to get airborne safely. Days earlier, in the rising tensions, one had already been destroyed on the ground, and no one wanted to take any more chances. F-82s were pulled from bases across Japan and Okinawa, some of them mid-repair, dragged out of maintenance, and made ready overnight. By the time Lieutenant Colonel John F. Sharp stood on the ramp at Itazake in the early hours of June 27th, he had a brand new unit, the 347th Provisional Fighter Group, with 27 models representing nearly 90% of every Twin Mustang the U.S. had in the entire theater. The aircraft lifted off from Itazake and crossed the Korea Strait in the dark, arriving over Kimpo just as the sun began to rise. Lieutenant Colonel Sharp had them stack into 3 orbiting flights, one above the other, each crew settling into the long circular pattern above the airfield, while below them, the last C-54s were still moving and loading their precious cargo. For hours, the crews sat in their cockpits, radar operators making sweep after sweep, while pilots watched the horizon. Then, shortly before noon, the radar operators spotted 5 aircraft, inbound fast, heading directly for the airfield, a mixed group of Soviet-built Yak-9s, Yak-11s, and La-7s, all World War II-era aircraft. Before anyone could react, a Yak-11 broke ahead of the formation and fired, sending several cannon rounds tearing into Lieutenant Charles Moran's vertical stabilizer. Nearby, Lieutenant William G. Hudson didn't wait for an order. Everyone called him Skeeter, and the nickname fit. He was already moving, already hauling the F-82 into a hard high G-turn, bleeding altitude, cutting inside the Yak's escape route before it could extend. After 5 years of peacetime patrols over Japan, Hudson knew his controls like the back of his hand. He clawed under the Yak's tail and closed the distance until he could see the rivets on the Yak's fuselage and squeezed the trigger. All 6 Browning M350 caliber machine guns opened up at once, 400 rounds per gun, catching the enemy aircraft's fuselage and making the North Korean brake hard right, trying to shake him. The American pilot stayed glued. Even though the F-82 was heavier than the Yak, Hudson refused to give up the angle. The second burst found the right wing, and the fuel tank went up immediately, the flash of orange that swallowed the wing root, and the right flap and aileron tore away in the slipstream. On with a malfunctioning camera, Hudson's radar operator, Lieutenant Carl Fraser, acted quickly, taking pictures of the YAK as it slipped away. By then, the YAK was falling sideways through the sky, trailing a smear of black smoke that bent south in the wind above Kimpo. Though the pilot ejected in the nick of time, his observer, either already hit or too badly hurt to move, went down with the aircraft. The victorious Hudson watched the parachute open and tracked it down, following the North Korean pilot with his eyes as he drifted through the smoke and morning air, and landed directly on Kimpo Airfield itself, right on the runway the C-54s were using. Surrounded before he even hit the ground by South Korean soldiers, already sprinting toward him from every direction, the man reached into his flight suit anyway, pulled out a pistol, and opened fire until he was silenced. Back in the air, Moran's vertical stabilizer was torn up, and the aircraft was handling wrong beneath him. He had every reason to break off, assess the damage, and head back to Japan. Instead, he brought the damaged F-82 around, found an LA-7, closed in, squeezed the trigger, and sent it down to the ground. A few miles away, Major James W. Little destroyed another one. 3 of the 5 North Korean aircraft were down in the span of minutes, while the other 2 broke off and disappeared back the way they came. Below the orbiting F-82s, the last of the C-54s lifted off the runway and climbed out safely. The 347th Provisional Fighter Group, a unit that Sharp had assembled overnight from spare parts and borrowed aircraft, and crews who had driven through the dark to reach their planes in time, had just fought and won the first American aerial battle since the end of World War II. All achieved by a piston-engined aircraft that everyone believed was past his prime. In the days that followed the Kimpo escape, the F-82 exceeded every single one of the United States Air Force's wildest expectations. The very thing that made jets superior, speed, altitude, and raw performance, were almost irrelevant in those first weeks. What the war actually needed in June 1950 was range, endurance, and the ability to fly in any conditions. As it turned out, the F-82 Twin Mustang was perfect for the job. Korea's weather closed in almost immediately. Low cloud, rain, fog sitting on the ground for days at a time, complete overcast that grounded everything without radar. While jets sat on ramps in Japan waiting for visibility, the Twin Mustangs were already over the peninsula, finding targets in conditions that made visual flight impossible. Crews from the Fighter All-Weather Squadron used the SCR-720 radar pod slung under the center wing, giving the crew the ability to find and track targets in weather and darkness that kept everything else on the ground. But it was the range that made it indispensable. During their sessions from Japan to Korea and back, which ran 5 to 6 hours over open water, one man flew while the other rested, switching off and working in unison. On June 28th, the day after the Kimpo Airfield escape, orders came down to release every available F-82 for ground attack, pressing them against anything North Korean, moving between the front lines and the 38th parallel. Gone were the days of air cover and escort. Now they were hunting. On July 10th, F-82s from the 4th and 68th Squadrons joined B-26 Invader bombers and F-80 fighter bombers over the main supply routes running south. One of the B-26s put its bombs directly onto a bridge at Pyeongtaek, collapsing it into the river and cutting the road in two. From one moment to the next, everything behind it stopped. Trucks at the front had nowhere to go. Armor further back couldn't turn around on a road barely wide enough to fit it. Drivers abandoned their vehicles and ran as fast as they could to the fields on either side. Others tried to reverse into the column behind them. Then, the F-82s came in low with their size 50 caliber guns, 400 rounds each, making pass after pass down a column that had nowhere to scatter and absolutely no room to run. The Twin Mustangs worked it from one end to the other, circling back, lining up again, hitting whatever was still moving. By the time the strike pulled away, 117 trucks, 38 tanks, and 7 personnel carriers were destroyed, and the road south was blocked in both directions for miles. Yet beneath all those shocking winds, the clock was running out. The The production of the F-82 ended all the way back in April 1948. Since no one expected this seemingly obsolete model to shine as bright as it did in the first big conflict since World War II, nobody had stocked spare parts, especially once jets became available. By the time Korea was on its second week, maintenance crews were already scavenging through wrecked and damaged airframes, desperately stripping whatever could be pulled and fitted to aircraft that still needed to fly. On June 30th, engineers at Far East Air Force sent a request up the chain for 21 additional F-82s. However, headquarters had no choice but to deny it. At the rate they were flying, the parts would last no more than 60 days. The stress on the crews was relentless. The 68th flew 35 combat sorties alone between June 26th and 30th, averaging 5 hours per sortie from landing, debriefing, eating, and sleeping. As the weeks went by, however, the air war over Korea changed shape entirely. By August, F-80s had done their job, being one of the main reasons for pushing the North Korean Air Force back above the 38th parallel until it stopped coming south in any numbers worth counting. With the summer, the dogfights and the big daylight strikes were thinning out. What was left was the work of night missions in bad weather, alone over terrain that offered nothing back to the eye. With the majority of squadrons that had carried the war's first days rotated out one by one back to the bases, the job fell to the 68th Squadron, flying through July and August against trains, vehicles, and troop columns on the roads, anything that moved after dark. On the night of August 27th, an element of F-82s was patrolling over South Korea above a thick overcast, when they were told United Nations ground troops somewhere beneath them were pinned down and taking heavy mortar fire. Knowing they needed immediate air support, the Twin Mustangs arrived at the location, but the darkness was never ending. Despite the ground being completely hidden, the crews began circling, working the radio, trying to raise the ground controller through the static, and the noise of men under fire, giving coordinates in the dark. Several passes just to establish contact, just to build enough of a picture to know where to go in. The radar operator with his face in the scope, and the pilot holding the aircraft steady, both of them listening. When the mortar positions were finally pinpointed, they went in without mercy. The pilot rolled in on the coordinates, the aircraft shuddering as all 6 guns opened up at a position neither man could see. Each pass ended in a hard pull, bleeding off the G-force before circling back and lining up again. Between each pass, the ground controller's voice came back through the static, adjusting the next run by degrees, while the ammunition counted down and the aircraft ran hot. After 45 minutes, with the last round gone, they pulled up and turned for home. Once on the ground, during the debrief, the crews learned their results. Every mortar position had gone silent. Ground forces moving in afterward counted over 300 enemy dead. The UN troops that had been pinned down were still alive. Through it all, F-82 crews had been in the air for hours and never saw a single thing they hit. Through the rest of 1950 and into 1951, the 68th kept flying combat air patrols over Seoul and armed reconnaissance over southern North Korea as the Chinese poured across the border and the situation on the ground began to look uncomfortably like June all over again. By then, the F-51s, the F-80s, and the F-84s were absorbing the ground attack work. With these faster and newer jets arriving in numbers that the F-82 never quite had, the writing was on the wall for the Twin Mustang. As August 1951 neared its end, only 8 operational F-82s remained in the entire 68th Squadron. The unit that had launched 27 aircraft to cover Kimpo on a single morning in June 1950 was down to a handful of airframes, held together by maintenance crews. On March 28, 1952, the last F-82G in Korea was pulled from service, followed by the remaining models in Japan in the months that followed. As the F-84 took over all-weather responsibilities in the Far East entirely, and the jet era that had been waiting in the wings since 1945 finally closed the door, the Twin Mustang headed north. The F-82s that arrived in Alaska from Korea were not the aircraft that had fought at Kimpo. They came in badly corroded, airframe stressed and fatigued from months of combat flying, high hours on engines that had been pushed hard over the peninsula for 2 years. Most went straight for assessment, and the verdict on most of them was the same: scrap. The few that passed inspection inherited a mission nobody else could cover. Alaska sits directly across the Bering Sea from Siberia, and Soviet aircraft flying out of Siberian airfields were constantly probing American air defenses, looking for gaps in radar coverage, testing response times, seeing what the Americans would do. The F-94 Starfires handled the intercepts when radar picked up incoming aircraft, but the jets didn't have the range to cover the vast stretches of remote Alaskan coastline where the gaps were widest. So while the jets handled close work, the Twin Mustangs patrolled continuously over remote villages, along the western coastline, around Nome, and deep into the interior, over what's now known as the North Slope. Periodically, they flew long-range reconnaissance missions near the Chukchi Peninsula in Siberia, checking old World War II-era Soviet landing strips for any signs of activity or buildup. Once in a while, they encountered Soviet aircraft, both sides watching, and neither willing to be the one that started something. In spring 1952, the type was flying escort for SAC B-36 Peacemaker bombers near Barter Island in the Beaufort Sea, roughly 1,000 miles south of the North Pole, the northernmost point any USAF aircraft was operating at the time. Every time the rivers nearby thawed and the ice jammed, it could flood entire towns with no warning, and the F-82s were sent in to fix it, dropping 500-pound bombs and firing 5-inch rockets directly at the ice to keep the rivers flowing over the Alaskan wilderness. By then, attrition was relentless, and the Air Force's solution was to put an experienced flight mechanic in the right seat on every long patrol, rather than a second pilot. This mechanic could diagnose whatever broke on a remote Arctic strip, fix it enough to get the aircraft airborne, and return it to Ladd Air Base. In the end, the operational life of the F-82 Twin Mustang was shockingly short. The last Twin Mustang in the operation inventory, an F-82G that had served in Okinawa and Japan before being modified for Alaskan winters, was officially retired on November 12, 1953, at Elmendorf Air Force Base. With that, the last American piston-engine fighter ordered into production by the United States Air Force, one that started a war and then ended its service life alone at the top of the world, with a mechanic in the right seat and ice on the wings, was no more.